All right, the plague. This is the third night of reading. I think we left off on April 18th in the book. And when we left off, we'd heard about how the town was in a sense of denial. The doctor kind of was too. Grand is writing a book, we think. And the rats have stopped dying and people have started. The first death toll, the first day with an actual death toll, had 11 deaths. Am I okay? I'll pick up where I left off. Part 1. We're still in part 1, but we're going to be done with that pretty soon. The next day, by dint of a persistence that many thought ill-advised, Ryu persuaded the authorities to convene a health committee at the prefect's office. People in town are getting nervous, that's a fact, Dr. Richard admitted. And of course all sorts of wild rumors are going around. The prefect said to me, "Take prompt action if you like, but don't attract attention." He's convinced personally that it's a false alarm. Ryu gave Castle a lift to the prefect's office. "Do you know," Castle said when they were in the car, "that we haven't a grand... Oh, my God, my dog. Hey, Phil. Why are you barking if you can do it? Come on." He barks at the stairs. "Do you know," Castle said when they were in the car, "we don't have a gram of serum in the whole district?" "I know. I rang up the depot and the director seemed startled. It'll have to be sent in from Paris." "Let's hope they're quick about it." "I sent a wire yesterday," Ryu said. The prefect greeted them amiably enough, but one could see his nerves were on edge. "Let's make a start, gentlemen," he said. "Should I review the situation?" Richard said it was unnecessary. He and his colleagues were acquainted with all the facts, and the only question was, what measures should be adopted? "The question," Old Castle cut in almost rudely, "is to know whether it's plague or not." 2 or 3 of the doctors present protested. The others seemed to hesitate. The prefect was startled and glanced toward the door to make sure it had prevented this outrageous word from being overheard in the corridor. Richard said that, in his opinion, the great thing was not to take an alarmist view. All that could be said at present was that we had a special type of fever, with inguinal complications. In medical science, as in daily life, it was very unwise to jump to conclusions. Old Castle, who was placidly chewing on his draggled yellow mustache, raised his pale, bright eyes and gazed at Ryu. And then, after sweeping the other members of the committee with a friendly glance, he said he knew quite well that it was plague. And, needless to say, he also knew that were this to be officially admitted, the authorities would be compelled to take very drastic steps. This was, of course, the explanation of his colleagues' reluctance to face the facts, and if it would ease their minds, he was quite prepared to say it wasn't plague. The prefect seemed very ruffled, and remarked that in any case, this line of argument didn't seem sound. "The important thing," Castle replied, "isn't the soundness or otherwise of the argument, but for it to make you think." Ryu, who had said nothing so far, was asked for his opinion. "We're dealing," he said, "with a fever of a typhoid nature, accompanied by vomiting and buboes. I have incised these buboes and had the pus analyzed. Our laboratory analyst believes that he has identified the plague bacillus. I am bound to add that there are specific modifications that don't quite tally with the classical description of the plague bacillus." Richard pointed out that this justified a policy of waiting and seeing. Anyhow, it would be wise to wait for the statistical report on the series of analyses that had been going on for several days. "When a microbe," Ryu said, "after a short intermission, can quadruple in 3 days' time the volume of the spleen, can swell the ganglia to the size of an orange and give them the consistency of gruel, A policy of wait and see is, to say the least of it, very unwise. The foci of infection are steadily extending. Judging by the rapidity with which the disease is spreading, it may well, unless we can stop it, kill off half the town before 2 months are out. That being so, it isn't important whether you call it plague or a rare fever. The important thing is to prevent it killing off half of the population of this town. Richard said it was a mistake to paint too gloomy a picture, and moreover, the disease hadn't been proved to be contagious. Indeed, some relatives of patients living under the same roof had escaped it. Others have died, though, Ryu said, and obviously contagion is never absolute. Otherwise, you'd have a constant mathematical progression and the death rate would rocket catastrophically. It's not a question of painting too black a picture. It's of taking precautions. Richard, however, summing up the situation, pointed out that if the epidemic did not stop spontaneously, it would be necessary to apply the prophylactic measures laid down in the code. And to do this, it would be necessary to admit officially that plague had broken out. But of this there was no certainty, therefore any hasty action was to be deprecated. Ryu stuck to his guns. The point isn't whether the measures provided for in the code are rigorous, but whether they are needful to prevent the death of half the population. Everything else is a matter of its administrative action. And I don't need to remind you that our Constitution has provided for such emergencies by empowering prefects to issue the necessary orders. This is true, the prefect said, but I need your professional declaration that the epidemic is the plague. If we don't declare that, Ryu said, there's a risk that half the population may die. Richard cut in with impatience. The truth is, our colleague is convinced it's plague. His description of the syndrome proved it. Ryu replied he had not described a syndrome, but merely what he'd seen with his own eyes. And what he had seen was buboes, and high fever, and delirium, which ended fatally within 48 hours. Could Richard take the responsibility upon himself of declaring that the epidemic would die out without the imposition of rigorous prophylactic measures? Richard hesitated, then fixed his eyes on Ryu. Answer me honestly. Are you absolutely convinced it's the plague? You're stating the problem wrongly. It's not a question of the word I use. It's a question of time. Your view, I take it, the prefect interrupted, is this. Even if it isn't plague, the prophylactic measures enjoined by law for coping with plague should be put into force immediately. If you insist on a view, then you're correct. The doctors confabulated among themselves, and Richard was their spokesman. It comes to this. We have to take the responsibility of acting as if the epidemic were the plague. This way of placing it in words met with general approval. It doesn't matter to me, Ryu said, how you phrase it or whose name you put on it. My point is that we should not act as if there was no likelihood that half the population could die, because if we do, then they will. Followed by scowls and protestations, he left the committee room. 10 minutes later, as he was driving down a back street, a woman screaming in agony with her groin dripping blood stretched out her arms toward him. On the day after the committee meeting, the fever notched another small advance. It even found its way into the papers, but very discreetly, with only a few brief references. The following day, however, Ryu observed that small official notices had been put up about the town, but in places where they would not attract very much attention. It was hard to find in them any indication that the authorities were facing any situation squarely, or what the situation even was. The measures were far from draconian, and one had the feeling that many concessions had been made in a desire not to alarm the public or disturb business. The instructions began with a bald statement that a few cases of a malignant fever had been reported in Oran. It was not yet possible to say if it was contagious. The symptoms were not marked as to be really perturbing, and the authorities felt sure they could rely on townspeople to treat the situation with composure. Nonetheless, guided by a spirit of prudence, the prefect was putting into force precautionary measures. If these were carefully studied and properly applied, they would prevent any risk of an epidemic. This being so, the prefect felt no doubt that everyone in his jurisdiction would wholeheartedly second his personal efforts. The notice outlined the program that the authorities had drawn up. It included a systematic extermination of the rat population by injecting poison gas into the sewers, followed by a strict supervision of the water supply. The townspeople were advised to practice extreme cleanliness, washing hands, and any who found fleas on their persons were directed to call at the municipal dispensaries. All heads of households were ordered to report any fever case diagnosed by their doctors, and to permit the isolation of sick members of their families in a special ward at the hospital. These wards, it was explained, were equipped to provide patients with immediate treatment and ensure the maximum prospect of recovery. Some other regulations enjoined compulsory disinfection of sick rooms and of cars in which the patients had traveled. For the rest, the prefect confined himself to advising all who had been in contact with the patients to consult the sanitary inspector and follow his advice strictly. Dr. Ryu swung around brusquely from this poster and went back to his surgery. Grand, who was awaiting him there, raised his arms dramatically when the doctor entered. I know, Dr. Ryu said. The figures are rising. On the previous day, 11 deaths had been reported. The doctor told Grand that he might be seeing him in the evening, as he promised to visit Cotard. An excellent idea, Grand said. You'll do him good. As a matter of fact, I find him greatly changed. In what way? Well, he's become friendly. He wasn't amiable before. Grand seemed at a loss. He couldn't say that Cotard used to be unamiable. The term wouldn't be correct. But Cotard was a silent and secretive man, with something around him that made Grand think of a wild boar. His bedroom, meals at the cheap restaurant, and mysterious coming and goings, these were the sums of Cotard's days. He described himself as a traveling salesman in wines and spirits. Now and then he was visited by 2 or 3 men, presumably customers. Sometimes in the evening he would go to a movie across the way. In this connection, Grand mentioned a detail he'd noticed, that Cotard seemed to have a preference for gangster films. But the thing that had struck him most about the man was his aloofness, or his mistrust of everyone he met. Hi, Sierra. Hi, Alex. And so, Grand said, there had been a complete change. I don't know quite how to put it, but I must say I have an impression that he is trying to make himself agreeable to everyone, to be in everybody's good books. He talks to me, he suggests we should go out together, but I can't bring myself to refuse. What's more, he's interesting. And, of course, I saved his life. Since his attempt at suicide, Cotard had no more visitors. In streets, in shops, he was always trying to make friends. To the grocer, he was affable. No one could take more pains than he to show his interest in the tobacconist's gossip. This particular tobacconist, a woman, by the way, Grand explained, is a holy terror. I told Cotard this, but he replied that I was prejudiced, and she had plenty of good points. You only had to get to know her. On 2 or 3 occasions, Cotard had invited Grand to come with him to the luxury restaurants and cafes of the town, which he had recently begun patronizing. There's a pleasant atmosphere in them, he explained, and you're in good company. Grand noticed that the staff made much of Cotard, and he soon discovered why when he saw the lavish tips his companion left behind. The traveling salesman seemed greatly to appreciate the amiability shown him in return for his money. One day, when the head waiter had escorted him to the door and helped him into his coat, Cotard said to Grand, "He's a very nice fellow, and he'd make a very good witness." "A witness? I don't follow." Cotard hesitated. "Well, he could say I'm not really a bad kind of man." His humor had its ups and downs. One day, when the grocer had shown less friendliness, he came home in a tearing rage. "He's siding with them, that swine." "With who?" "The whole damned lot of them," Cotard said. Grand had personally witnessed an odd scene that took place at a tobacconist. An animated conversation was in progress, and the woman behind the counter started airing her views about a murder case that had created a stir in Algiers. A young commercial employee had killed an Algerian on a beach. "I always say," the woman began, If they clapped all that kind of scum in jail, decent folks could breathe more freely. She was too startled by Cottard's reaction as he dashed out of the shop without a word to continue. Grand and the woman gazed after him, dumbfounded. Subsequently, Grand reported to the doctor other changes in Cottard's character. Cottard had always professed very liberal ideas, and his pet dictum on economic questions, big fish eat little fish. But now the only Oran newspaper he bought was the conservative one, and one could hardly help suspecting that he made a point of reading it in public places. Somewhat of the same order was a request he made to Grand shortly before he left his sickbed. Grand mentioned he was going to the post office, and Cottard asked him to be kind enough to send a money order for 100 francs to his sister, living at a distance, mentioning that he sent her this sum every month. And then, as Grand was leaving the room, he called him back. "No, send her 200 francs. That'll be a nice surprise for her. She believes I never think about her, but actually I'm devoted to her." Not long after this, he made a curious remark to Grand in the course of conversation. He had badgered Grand into telling him about the somewhat mysterious private work to which Grand gave his evenings. "I know," Cottard said. "You're writing a book, aren't you?" "Something, but it's not as simple as that," said Grand. "Ah, I only wish I had a knack for writing." When Grand seemed surprised, Cottard explained with some embarrassment that being a literary man must make things easier in a lot of ways. "Why?" Grand asked. "Well, because an author has more rights than an ordinary person, as everybody knows. People will stand much more from him." "It looks," said Ryu to Grand on the morning when the official notices were posted, "as if this business of the rats has addled his brain, as it has done for so many other people. That's all it is. Or maybe he's afraid of the fever." "I don't think so, Doctor. If you want to know my opinion—" And Grand paused. With a machine gun rattle from its exhaust, the de-ratting van was clattering by. Ryu kept silent until it was possible to make himself heard, then asked, without much interest, what Grand's opinion was. "He's a man with something pretty serious on his conscience," Grand said gravely. The doctor shrugged. As the inspector had said, he had other fish to fry. That afternoon, Ryu had another talk with Old Castle. The serum from Paris had not yet come. "In any case," Ryu said, "I wonder if it would be much use. This bacillus is a very strange one." "There," Castle said, "I don't agree with you. These little brutes always have an air of originality, but at the bottom it's always the same plague." "That's your theory, anyhow. But of course we don't know much on the subject." "I grant you," said Castle, "it's only my theory, but in a sense that goes for everybody." Throughout the day, the doctor was conscious that the slightly dazed feeling that came over him whenever he thought about the plague was growing more pronounced. Finally, he realized that he was afraid. On 2 occasions, he entered crowded cafes. He felt a need for friendly contact, human warmth. A stupid instinct, he told himself, but it reminded him that he had promised to visit the traveling salesman. Cottard was standing by the dining room table when the doctor entered his rooms that evening. A detective story was open on the tablecloth, but the night was closing in, and it would have been difficult to read in the growing darkness. Most likely Cottard had been sitting, musing in the twilight until he heard the doorbell ring. Ryu asked how he was feeling. Cottard sat down and replied that he was feeling tolerably well, grumpily adding that he'd feel better if he could be sure of being left alone. Ryu remarked that one couldn't always be alone. "That's not what I mean. I was thinking of people who take an interest in you only to make trouble for you." When Ryu said nothing, he went on. "Mind you, that's not my case, only I've been reading that detective story. It's about a poor devil who was arrested one fine morning, all of a sudden. People took an interest in him, and he knew nothing about it. They talked about him in offices, put his name on card indexes. Do you think that's fair? Do you think people have a right to treat a man like that?" "Well," said Ryu, "it depends. In one sense, I agree, nobody has the right. But that's beside the mark. What's important is for you to go out a bit. It's a mistake staying indoors too much." Cottard seemed vexed, and said that on the contrary, he was always going out, and if need arose, all the people in the street could vouch for him. What's more, he knew plenty of people in other parts of the town, too. "Do Do you know the architect? He's a friend of mine. The room was almost completely dark. Outside, the street was growing noisier, and a sort of murmur of relief greeted the moment when all the street lamps lit up, all together. Ryu walked onto the balcony, and Cottard followed him. From the outlying districts, as happens every evening in the town, a gentle breeze wafted a murmur of voices, roasting meat, and a gay, perfumed tide of freedom on its way, as the streets filled up with noisy young people released from the shops and offices. Nightfall, with its deep, remote baying of unseen ships, the rumor from the sea, and the happy tumult of the crowd, that first hour of darkness which in the past had always had a special charm for Ryu, today seemed charged with menace, because of all he knew. "How about turning on the lights?" he suggested when they went back into the room. As he did, Cottard gazed at him, blinking his eyes. "Tell me, doctor, if I became ill, would you put me in your ward at the hospital?" "Why not?" Cottard then inquired if it ever happened that a person in a hospital or nursing home was arrested. Ryu said it had been known to happen, but it depended on the invalid's condition. "You know, doctor," Cottard said, "I have confidence in you." Then he asked the doctor if he'd be kind enough to give him a ride into town. In the center of town, the streets were already growing less crowded and the lights fewer. Children were playing in front of the doorways. At Cottard's request, the doctor stopped his car beside one of the groups of children. They were playing hopscotch and making a great deal of noise. One of them, a boy with sleek, neatly parted hair and a grubby face, stared very hard at Ryu with bright and bold eyes. The doctor looked away. Standing on the sidewalk, Cottard shook his head. Then he said in a hoarse, very labored voice, casting glances over his shoulder, "Everybody's talking about an epidemic. Is there anything in it, doctor?" "People always talk," Ryu replied. "That's to be expected." "Well, you're right, and if we have 10 deaths, they'll think it's the end of the world. But it's not that we need here." The engine was ticking over. Ryu had his hand on the clutch, but he looked again at the boy who was still watching him with a very grave intentness. And then suddenly, unexpectedly, the child smiled, showing all of his teeth. "Yes, and what do we need here?" Ryu asked, returning the child's smile. Cottard gripped the door of the car, and as he turned to go, almost shouted in a passionate voice, "An earthquake! A big one!" There was no earthquake, and the whole of the following day was spent, as far as Ryu was concerned, in long drives to every corner of town, to talk to families of the sick and argue with invalids. Never had Ryu known his profession to weigh on him so heavily. Until now, his patients had helped to lighten his task. They gladly put themselves into his hands. But for the first time, the doctor felt they were keeping aloof, wrapping themselves in their malady with a sort of bemused hostility. It was a struggle to which he wasn't yet accustomed. And yet, at 10 that evening, as he parked his car outside the home of his old asthma patient, his last visit of the day, it was a sheer effort for Ryu to drag himself from his seat. For some moments he lingered, gazing up at the dark street, watching the stars appear and disappear in the blackness of the sky above it. When he finally entered the room, the old man was sitting up in bed, at his usual occupation, counting dried peas from one pan to another. When he saw the doctor, he looked up, beaming with delight. "Well, doctor, it's cholera, isn't it?" "Where on earth did you get that idea from?" "It's in the newspaper and the radio, too." "It's not cholera," said the doctor. "Anyhow," the man said. Oh, the dog knocked it over. Cosmo! Alright. Okay, you guys took a ride. I'm going to wave to everyone. Hi, everyone. Okay. It's not the cholera. Whoa, stay where you are. Okay. Anyhow, the old man chuckled excitedly, the big bugs are laying it on thick. They've got the jitters, haven't they? Don't you believe a word of it, the doctor said. He had finished examining the old man and was sitting in the middle of the dingy little dining room. But despite what he said, he was afraid. He knew that in this suburb alone, 8 or 10 unhappy people nearby, cowering over their buboes, would be waiting for him to visit the next morning. In only 2 or 3 cases had incision of them had any improvement. For most of them, it would mean going to the hospital, and he knew how poor people felt about hospitals. "I don't want them trying their experiments on him," had said one of the wives of his patients. But he wouldn't be experimented on. He would simply die. That the regulations now in force were inadequate was lamentably clear. As for the specially equipped wards, he knew what they were. 2 outbuildings from which other patients had been ejected, and whose windows had been hermetically sealed, and around which a sanitary cordon had been set. The only hope was that the outbreak would die a natural death. It certainly would not be arrested by the measures the authorities had so far put in place. Nevertheless, that night, the official communiqué was still optimistic. On the following day, Ransdorf announced that the rules laid down by the local administration had won approval, and already 30 sick people had reported to the hospital. Castle rang up Ryu. "How many beds are there in that ward?" 80, he said. "Surely there's more than 30 sick people in town." "Don't forget, there are 2 sorts of cases, those who become afraid, and those, the majority, who don't have time to become afraid." "I see. Are they checking on the burials?" "No. I told Richard over the phone that energetic measures were needed, not just words. We need to set up a real barrier against this disease, otherwise we might as well just do nothing." "And what did he say?" "Nothing doing. He claims he hasn't the power. In my opinion, because of him, it's going to get worse." And it was true. Within 3 days, both wards were full, 80 patients. According to Richard, there was talk of requisitioning a school and possibly opening an auxiliary hospital. Ryu continued incising buboes and waiting for the anti-plague serum to come from Paris. Old Castle went back to his books and spent long hours in the public library. Those rats died of plague, was his conclusion, or of something very much like it. And they've loosed on the town tens of thousands of their fleas, which will spread the infection in geometrical progression unless it's checked in time. Ryu did not reply. About this time, the weather set fair, and the sun had drawn up the last puddles left by the recent rain. There was a serene blue sky, flooded with golden light each morning, and sometimes a drone of planes in the rising heat. All seemed well in the world. And yet within 4 days the fever made 4 startling steps. 16 deaths, 24, 28, then 32. On the 4th day, the opening of the auxiliary hospital in the premises of a previous primary school was officially announced. The local population, who so far had made a point of masking their anxiety with facetious comments, joking questions, and humor, now seemed tongue-tied and went their ways with gloomy faces, quietly. Ryu decided to ring up the prefect. "The regulations don't go far enough," he said. The prefect replied, "Yes, I've seen the statistics, and as you say, they're perturbing." "They're not perturbing, they're conclusive," said Dr. Ryu. "I'll have to ask the government for orders." "Cosmo! Come on up!" "Hi. Yes, you can do it. Come on. Yes, come on. Come on. Come on. Come here, little sundowner. Yes, I know. Yes, he's senile. I'll have to ask the government for orders," the prefect said. When Ryu met Old Castle, the prefect's remark was still rankling him. "Orders," he said, "when what's needed is imagination and action." "Any news of the serum?" "It'll come this week, just like they said before." The prefect sent instructions to Ryu, through Richard, asking him to draw up orders, a minute to be transmitted for orders to the central administration of the colony. Ryu included in it a clinical diagnosis and all the statistics he had on the epidemic. On that day, 42 deaths were reported. The prefect took the responsibility, as he put it, of tightening up the new regulations. Compulsory declaration of all cases of fever and their isolation were strictly enforced. The residences of sick people were to be shut up and disinfected. People living in the same house were to go into quarantine. Burials were to be supervised by the local authorities, in a manner we will describe later on. The next day, the serum finally arrived by small plane. There was enough for immediate requirements, but not enough if the epidemic spread any further. In reply to his telegram, Ryu was informed that the emergency reserve stock was exhausted and had not been kept up, but that a new supply was being prepared. Meanwhile, from all the outlying districts, spring was making its progress into town. Thousands of roses wilted in the flower tenders' baskets in the marketplaces and along the streets, and the air was heavy with their cloying, sweet perfume. Outwardly, indeed, this spring was like every other. Streetcars were packed at rush hour, untidy during the rest of the day. Teru watched the little old man and the little old man spat on the stray cats. Grand hurried home every evening to his mysterious literary activities. Cottard went on his usual desultory ways, and Othon, the magistrate, continued to parade his menagerie. The old Spaniard moved his dried peas from pan to pan, and sometimes you could see Rambert, the journalist, looking interested in everything he saw. In the evening, the usual crowd thronged the streets, and the lines lengthened outside the picture houses. What's more, the epidemic seemed to be on the wane. On one day, only about 12 deaths were notified. But then all of a sudden, the death toll reached 30. It shot up again vertically. Dr. Ryu read an official telegram that the prefect had just handed him, remarking, "So they've gotten alarmed at last." The telegram said, "Proclaim state of plague. Stop. Close the town. Stop." That is part 1. This is part 2 coming up next. This town has admitted that the plague is there. This town has I think a couple hundred deaths now. They've got a full hospital and 2 overflow hospitals full. People are being quarantined, shut up in their houses. Mitigation is what they are doing right now. Up till now, they have tried to mitigate with social distancing, which wasn't working because people were still going out. The notices weren't very clear about what to do. The local government and doctors are not seriously enough warning people at this point. And so the epidemic has spread with all the fleas that the rats brought into the town. And tomorrow I'm going to pick up on part 2. I would say if you were going to take this book as the chronicle of any generic plague or pandemic, the point at which authorities begin to weigh the cost of human life versus the economy is somewhere in part 2 of this book. They've already fucked up because they did that. Business doesn't matter when everybody could die. That's so far what we've been told repeatedly by this. Because it's a very business-like town. It's an industrious little town. They are proud of it. So, yeah, part 1's very, very good lead-in. We'll pick up with Dr. Ryu and Cottard and Grand tomorrow. I'll read a little bit longer because part 2 is a little bit more intense. And it'll be around 10 or 11 o'clock again. So, go to sleep. Go the fuck to sleep.